Hey guys, for today's 3-minute Bible study, I wanted to bring us to John chapter 11, starting in verse 21. This is a situation where Mary and Martha have just lost their brother Lazarus, who has just died 4 days prior, and Jesus shows up, and Martha has a conversation with Jesus. She says this, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." I want to introduce us to a tension. A tension that is caused between two poles. On the one hand, we have the hope of resurrection, that followers of Jesus believe that in the last day we will rise again, and it's going to be this glorious new creation. That's our hope. But we hold that in tension with another truth, which is we live in a fallen world, and it's broken. It's been marred and warped by sin. There is death and disease and decay and destruction all around us. And so how do we hold these two things in tension? And I think of right now with this global pandemic, when what we see around us is sickness and fear and worry and uncertainty and anxiety about the situation. How do we hold that in tension with the hope we have in resurrection without totally forgetting about our situation, without kind of becoming one of those weird people that only thinks of heaven and never really thinks of what's going on in our daily lives? Well, notice in Jesus' conversation with Martha, he actually hits on this tension. He says this in verse 25. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live." Jesus is hitting on the tension. He's saying, I am resurrection and you will die. Yes, you will die. Okay, so he acknowledges that truth, that we live in a broken world stained by death. It'll come to all of us. There are reasons to be afraid. There are things that worry us, plague us, that we struggle with, that just wreck us with fear and anxiety. We recognize all of that. But he says, even though he shall die, yet shall he live. Jesus is introducing us to the tension that we live in a broken world, but even so, we can place our hope in resurrection. And so I love this. Now, you might then ask, well, how do I live in that tension? Well, tension is a really important principle for Christians to recognize. Just as tension gives a guitar strings its melody, so also tension gives us the kind of harmonious trust in God. When we see the poles of these two truths and we hold those in tension, we can then come to a beautiful understanding of all God has for us. The way we live in that tension is by believing in Him. See, Martha had a doctrine of resurrection. She had hope in resurrection. It was a beautiful thing. She said to him in verse 24, "Yeah, I know that my brother will rise again in the last day." So she had this hope in resurrection. But when Jesus introduces her to that tension, her faith is focused to, instead of trusting in doctrine and in that hope of resurrection only, she places her hope in Jesus himself. She says at the end of verse 27, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." So how can we live in a broken world like ours and yet still somehow hope in the future when all that's going on around us pretty much says otherwise? How do we do that? We follow Jesus. the one who is the resurrection of the life. He is the one who lived in a body, who understood humanity, and yet rose again. He is the one who was tempted just as we are, yet without sin. He is the one who suffered and died, and yet also overcame the sins of the world. He himself lives in that tension. And so for you, you might be living in a place where all around you, you're seeing that brokenness. And you're wondering, how can I recognize and deal with this while still holding on to hope? I'll tell you how. By placing your trust in Jesus. He is the resurrection and the life. You can put your trust in him and follow him, and he will take you every step of the way, all the way into eternity.